You are listening to the Breaktime Tech Talks podcast, a bite-sized tech podcast for busy developers, where we'll briefly cover technical topics, news snippets, and more in short time blocks. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, an avid developer and problem solver with special interest in data, learning, and all things technology. This episode is apparently going to be all about agents. It wasn't intended that way, but that's where my exploration has led me this week. After running into issues trying to do GraphRAG with Spring AI advisors, I started turning to tool calling, which is often used synonymously with agentic functionality. I'll explain how things went on that, plus a few other updates, and then jump into a content piece that was released this week about building agents in Java. Let's go. First on the agenda is to talk about my experience with Spring AI tool calling. I have both a vector search and graph retrieval as tools, and the example is available on GitHub. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. I mentioned last week that I was stuck on advisors, and I've taken a few more stabs at that functionality this week with no success just yet. But while I'm noodling on that, I went ahead and dug into tools just a little bit. I've talked about agentic frameworks before, or agentic workflows before. You can see episode 35 for a bit more detail on that. But just as an overview, they are typically where you expose a few different paths for a large language model to take in order to answer a question or solve a problem coming in. As an example, someone might ask about information on a company, and the application or the large language model will decide whether to run a web search, query a database, and or build a customer profile with sales data. They can retrieve data or take actions, and agents can vary on a scale of following a precisely defined workflow, series of steps, all the way to making decisions and pretty much operating autonomously. Going back to my example, though, I do have a working example in my Spring AI-Goodreads repository. I will save a link to that in the show notes. And I have two different tools that operate. One is a vector search tool, and then the other is a graph retrieval tool. So I have that same workflow that I've been working on where I have a vector search and then a graph query that runs on top of that to pull extra relationship and related information. And I have this vector graph process, and I need to execute both tools. I was a little bit worried when I put in this tool functionality about consistency, whether the large language model would decide to use a tool or both tools or not entirely. But so far, I've had good results. It's run everything that I needed it to. It's consistent, executing both the tools that I need in order to retrieve the data. And there's not a lot of manual mapping or boilerplate. The large language model can infer what's needed and how to transform the input. With a little bit of minor preparation, I will add. You still have to do a little bit of deserializing JSON. To back up and explain that a little bit, both tools and advisors will pass data and context using JSON formats. So you often end up dealing with deserialization of the JSON in order to pass or parse different components of that you might need as output and input for various tools. But the alternative is to do all that mapping and steps manually, as I've done in my manual GraphRAG approach, which is on the main branch of that repository. And I still feel like this is a better way, just dealing with a little bit of deserializing JSON and passing stuff than doing all of it manually. You trade one inconvenience for another, but the auto configure does make less boilerplate on tools and the tool calling itself. So that's the overview of tools. You can check out the repository for all of the updated code. It's also sitting on Spring AI 1.0, so everything should be current there. I feel like I've just scratched the surface on this tool and agentic types of functionality and applications, though. So I hope to explore and do a little bit more in-depth research and playing around with it to see what else there is and other things that I might be able to add to it. I also, though, updated the main branch of that same repository to Spring AI 1.0, so you can look at the manual GraphRAG approach using Spring AI 1.0, and then look at the AI tool branch for the tool calling and stuff, also sitting on 1.0. If I can get an advisors section working, I haven't found a way to get a clean version of the vector search results into the graph retrieval query without creating a lot of boilerplate, which was kind of the whole idea for going to the advisors, was to try to avoid the boilerplate in the first place. But if I can get that working, that will also be sitting on Spring AI 1.0. So everything should be up to date and consistent there, assuming I can get all the pieces in place. Then the content piece that I came across this week was just released earlier this week. It's called Agentic AI with Java and Neo4j. I was really excited to see a piece of Java and AI content out there, and it's also from someone at Neo4j, which is even better. Thank you, Christopher Bergman, for writing this and publishing this. The author makes a differentiation between GraphRAG, or traditional GraphRAG, if you will, and agentic GraphRAG. For instance, agentic GraphRAG, according to the article, is where large language model decides how to traverse the graph, where traditional GraphRAG is a set pattern or query in order to answer the question. So in agentic, the model, large language model, determines what kinds of patterns and what kinds of cipher it needs to construct in order to help answer the question. And traditional GraphRAG is going to be almost a hard-coded query that it's going to use to answer different questions using that same query. Initially, text to cipher didn't really entice me that much. I felt that giving the LLM free rein to create and run cipher queries seemed fraught with peril and pretty buggy. But as I've explored and seen more and more use cases, one is also outlined in this article, I'm seeing that text to cipher could be extremely invaluable when you're not sure what all questions will get thrown at the application. If you don't want a lot of I don't know answers, for instance, then text to cipher would at least try to make an attempt at solving the problem. And of course, you would need to lock it down with permissions and read-only and traversal, RBAC procedures, and so on. But this opens up the opportunity for answering more questions and more broader applications than just a hard-coded set pattern query. The article starts by explaining the background of the project and the steps that have been done previously, and then jumps into this post's agentic component. First, it starts by registering the agent. This example uses OpenAI as the model of choice, but also says there are plenty of other models to choose from that will work perfectly well here. And actually, I didn't realize you needed to register an agent. And later in the article, it shows you how to do this programmatically too, so you don't have to go through the UI if you don't want to register your agent. Then the article walks through setting up the Java library to execute and manage the agent and tools. This is basically the agentic framework, if you will, and the author walks through creating this manually so you understand what's going on under the hood of these AI frameworks. I find this really fascinating and kind of interesting as well, just to know what other frameworks are doing that we don't see under the hood. The article closes by saying that this example should be used as a way to demonstrate how agentic AI works, not as a production grade library. So this is for demo purposes only that he has constructed this library, so we can see under the hood of how frameworks operate. It includes a list of things that the library would need before being considered production ready. And instead of doing all of that, recommends other existing solutions for production ready frameworks that are already there. Today, we focused everything around agents, my exploration, and the content that I came across. I discussed my exploration of running GraphRAG with Spring AI tools, using tools for vector search and graph retrieval, and then I walked through an article for how Christopher Bergman at Neo4j built a demo library for agents with Java and Neo4j. Thanks for listening, and happy coding.